Alright, you guys, so before the tour moves on to Asia, I still got a little bit of US Open business to get cleared up and sorted out. That's right, we're finally doing it. 2 years later, we are finally claiming the career Grand Slam on this channel for my 2010s Major Champion rankings. If you haven't seen them already, I have already ranked the champions of the 2010s at the Australian Open, Roland Garros, and Wimbledon. They are in my historical ranking playlist if you would like to go visit those again. But obviously this one has been a long time coming. I also think it's perfect timing with Carlos Alcaraz putting forth this year probably the first all-time special US Open run performance in a really long time in my estimation, because a lot of our recent champs, taking nothing away from them, it has very much boiled down to survival of the fittest at this point in the tennis calendar for the year's last major. Just as a bit of a refresher, I've always tried to best base these rankings off of what I think is the best combination of dominance, opposition, peaks, performances, and admittedly, at times just vibes. So for this ranking, I decided, to shake things up a little bit, maybe just make things a little bit more empirical, even though at the end of the day, there will always still be a little element of subjectivity, but I just wanted to put out the stats via the best stat-keeping Bible in tennis, Tennis Abstract. Left to right, you're going to see dominance ratio, a metric that basically measures the ratio of return points won to opponents' return points won. Oftentimes a nifty little stat that can be telling in the sort of margin for error that a player's been working with relative to their opposition. And then ace percentage, double fault percentage, first serves in, first serve 1 percentage, second serve 1 percentage, break points saved, and time of matches. Also on each placard, I guess, I will also be flashing up the overall dominance ratio over the course of the entire tournament from the winner, and also a breakdown of the wins they got along the way by ranking, just to see how many seeds were faced and stuff like that. So with that out of the way, let's get into this list. Coming in at number 10, we got 2016 Stan Wawrinka. This is a really interesting one to me because I do think on paper, and having watched those matches, I think it is a pretty impressive US Open run where opposition's rankings are sort of deceiving, especially in the case of Juan Martín del Potro, who was just coming off of really an inspired run at the Olympics and was in the midst of starting that last great push of his career from 2016 to 2018. But at the same time, he did so in a fashion that I never felt like he was overwhelming or like the untouchable buzzsaw that he indisputably was at times in his other 2 slam wins, that I would even say he was at times during Roland Garros 2017. In this case, it was very much just like survival of the fittest, as is the case, honestly, for a lot of recent US Open champions, and, is just the product of the placement in the calendar, during which time fatigue is starting to settle in. But getting back to Stan, this was a very, very gritty US Open win. Of course, he saves a match point, trailing Dan Evans almost the entirety of their third round match. He survives. Many a time you see when people escape matches like that and go on to win the title, it sort of just unlocks a freedom that they play with the rest of the tournament. But that's not really what happened for Stan here. For 2 sets, he was really on a knife's edge against Del Potro, and especially Nishikori. Very easily could have gone down 2 sets in that match. And then in the final, it was a weird tournament. Djokovic sort of thrust into this final by default with a lot of people unhealthy. And that includes Novak himself, who was really just beginning what would become a free fall from that tippy-top peak mid-2016. In the final in particular, I do think this was about as best as that version of Djokovic could offer up, so I don't completely discount that. Stan, even still, while not playing his best and putting much separation between him and Novak in that final, he was ultimately able to physically outlast him and break him down at the end. And that's the theme of this title. He was really clutch, he hung tough, very gritty tournament, and he was the last man standing for it. Number 9, oh man. It honestly kind of hurts me to put 2017 Nadal here. I know for a lot of people he would be last on this list because it is sort of an unprecedented situation here, where Rafa goes through the tournament without playing a top 25 player. But let me put on my fanboy cap here. The projected draw for this tournament, and I didn't even have to look this up, I remember off rip, that for week 2, beginning with round 4, he was supposed to play Berdych, Dimitrov, who had a career year, Federer, and then Andy Murray. And that's the whole reason that this whole draw ended up getting really mucked up, because Murray, of course, ended up pulling the plug from this tournament once the draw was made. That put Federer and Nadal in one half. That was always going to make for a weird finalist coming out here. But what I will say on the tennis part, I have mentioned on this channel before that, I feel that it's very sparingly that I would say one of the big three played like prime adjacent, really all-time great level in their 30s. And for Rafa, it has always been very clear-cut for the entirety of 2 tournaments. I think it's RG17, and I think it's Wimbledon 2018. I don't think he has actually ever played that type of, needle-moving tennis on a hard court into that elite post-prime phase of his career. Very consistent, awesome against the field, just didn't have that peak to my eye. But, gun to my head, if I had to choose one time that I thought he was closest to that, I probably would say the second week of this tournament into Asia before he got injured. You play who's in front of you. I won't lie, he had it nice and cushy into the semifinals. Came into the event not playing great, started slow the first 2 matches. But after the second set against Leo Meyer, third round, it really picked up. And listen, end of the day, these guys are professionals. I don't care who it is, posting the stats and score lines that Nadal did from that point on in the tournament, barely dropping serve. I mean, you have to be playing well. And I do think for Rafa's part, he was really sharp. I can't really argue with you that much if you say he was untested, but I do think even that facet looks worse than it actually was. I mean, this was the tournament that put Del Potro back into being like a top 10 level player, just like the year before. It's a bit misleading because Del Potro started 2016 trying to build back up from outside the world's top 1,000. It was a lot of toil, a lot of hard draws to keep him from making further inroads by this point. But he had beaten Dominic Thiem in an epic. He had beaten Roger Federer, who I know was handicapped this tournament, but still it was a good win there. You can tell me he was tired, but Juan Martín Del Potro seldom gets flattened like that in one of these big matches, and he has notoriously been great at managing fatigue. And yeah, I remember watching that match, Rafa just hitting winners left and right from everywhere, in every direction. And I did think to myself watching it live, like this is probably right there in tier 2 among some of the best matches he's ever played on a hard court. And then the final, also Kevin Anderson was on his way to his best stretch this tournament into 2018, also making an injury comeback. Not as dangerous as Del Potro for sure, but again, to dismantle a guy with a serve like that, I think you always have to be playing really well. No extended set here, never touched on serve, never faces a break point. Clean as a whistle for Rafael Nadal's 16th Slam and 3rd US Open title. Alas, just not enough data within this tournament to put it higher. And on that note, I do think 2017 Nadal played better than this number 8 entry, and that is 2019 Rafael Nadal. Truth be told, I do sort of view 17 through 19, where it's Nadal, Djokovic, Nadal, a bit in the same bucket. Clearly, best players in the event, injuries happen throughout the draw. Draw is relatively open. They smelled blood, won the trophy. Actually, I suppose you could put 2016 Wawrinka into that category as well. I do think the 3 years following the champions did play better than he did. But it's along the same lines, and honestly, you could order those 4 to me any way that you see fit. But yeah, 2019 Nadal, throughout the course of this tournament, Relatively clean, relatively clinical, a lot made of the serving through week one. Has one of his most iconic US Open moments ever with the around the net and getting all of Arthur Ashe Stadium on their feet in a really electrifying moment there against Marin Cilic in the fourth round. The vibes were off the chart. Also, this outfit is an all-timer. It's very popular, as many of you will know. For old Rafa, Diego Schwartzman was often quite the pest. Even if Rafa won most times, it did entail some real lung-busting rallies and a lot of breaks of serve. No different here, but most of the times that Rafa was able to straight set a Fabio Fognini or Diego Schwartzman, he was usually playing pretty well. Pretty solid outing against Matteo Berrettini in the semifinals, who was also on his way to soon becoming a top 8-10 mainstay for a couple years there. But yeah, the interesting part about this run is, of course, in the final against Daniil Medvedev, we went in, Rafa having demolished Medvedev in the finals of Canada in the lead up to this event, which despite Daniil's stellar summer, which saw him win Cincinnati soon after, it really had nobody giving him a shot in this match. It seemed like a formality that Nadal was going to waltz to this fourth US Open title, and it did look like that for 2.5 sets, with Nadal leading 2 sets and a break relatively comfortably. From this point, it's a bit weird, I will admit, because I do think Rafa's 2019 final is the best win that anybody had to this point on the list. Because Medvedev really was awesome this summer and all the way up through Shanghai after this tournament. This was his first real, world beater streak that he would go on. And it is among the best that he ever did go on. And he started playing really tremendous tennis in this final in the second half of it. I think this match, for some reason, really gets slept on. In a time where since 2015 we haven't had that many quality US Open finals, this one was awesome in terms of the theatrics, in terms of the quality, in terms of how entertaining it was to watch. Both these guys were really deploying some really fun tactics. Both guys were net rushing a lot in this match and doing so effectively. And the thing is, it's weird because I heap all this praise on the match. I think it is an amazing match, and by proxy, an amazing win. But my gripe with 2019 Nadal comes here, where I'm like, it really didn't have to be that dramatic. This turned into one of the most stressful matches as a Rafa fan. This was about to be the choke of nightmares, because what really let Medvedev back in and turned him into this bulldozer that Nadal really needed to throw everything into slamming the brakes to halt his momentum was just some really uncharacteristically loose play. It happened in a small window, particularly being sort of bad on overheads in this match and missed a couple of sitters, and that's all Medvedev needed. To an extent, after Nadal saved some early break points in the fifth set, parity was restored, but then with just shot legs, he was dangerously close to coughing up a double break lead in the fifth set as well. Really just got over the line by the skin of his teeth. Super satisfying win, but I don't really think any of his other title-winning forms would have allowed it to get that close. But he did win the match, and it was a very quality win in my estimation. That matters to me, so Nadal 2019 lands here at 8. Number 7, 2018 Novak Djokovic. Don't have as much to say, and that's probably a good thing for time's sake, of course. Rambled a little over time for my Nadal editions here. But yeah, after being in some real trouble for most of 3 sets in blazing heat of his first round match, Djokovic was large and in charge at the 2018 US Open. Never really in a spot of bother ever again throughout the course of this tournament, honestly. If you just look at it through the lens of dominance, it probably is his most dominant US Open title. Part of an underrated stretch, I think, as well, after Djokovic re-announced that he was back at Wimbledon this year. From 2018 Wimbledon through the 2019 Aussie, a really dominant stretch out of Novak. A lot of great wins this US Open, a part of that. Also relatively untested, but again, when you look that good, you're winning that comfortably. I'm not one to really question it that much. Marquee performances come, semis, finals against the resurgent Kei Nishikori and a great returner. Never gets broken in that match, crushes him, and then again, Del Potro had played great in the lead up to the final. And like I said before, a guy that's stubborn, hard to beat comfortably in these big matches. But Djokovic played a great final, kept him at arm's length, kept him from getting his teeth into this match at any point, really offered up minimal openings. Suffocating as ever, in particular, did a great job, defending, absorbing up the pace. We all remember the point of him sliding around, soaking up these huge Del Potro blows to steal the point. And yeah, emblematic of an all-around very complete performance in this final, in this tournament. I think he's underrated. Number 7, 2018, Djokovic. At number 6, give me 2012 Andy Murray. Now this run is probably the least dominant on this list, but I do think it makes up for it in some way, with Andy putting together some really quality wins. Guys like Feli Lopez, Milos Raonic, Marin Cilic, Thomas Berdych, of course. All quality players at this time in varying capacity. On any given day could be really, really tough outs, and Murray found that out throughout the course of this tournament. Was on a knife's edge for 4 sets against Feli Lopez. Won 3 tiebreak sets in that one, and then notoriously against Marin Cilic, especially since this ended up being Murray's first Grand Slam tournament. And always having a flair for the dramatic, Murray found himself in the quarterfinals down a set and 5-1 to an inspired Marin Cilic. And shockingly enough, he would not have to rally from 2 sets to love down. In fact, from that point on, he only ended up losing 3 more games the rest of the match. Go figure. Ranking this run's placement in this list is as hard as any, really. But yeah, in a precursor of things to come, Murray and Berdych staged a 4-hour 4-setter in damn near hurricane-like conditions. Super, super windy. Murray rallies from a set down. Berdych had a set point to send this one 5, but got it done in 4 in the end. And then, of course, the final, which is one of the poorest of the Big 3, Big 4 era. Wind, obviously a factor, but this is a really bad match if you go back and revisit it. You talk about winning ugly, this is it. Of course, throughout his career, Djokovic never really seemed to get the most comfortable in windy conditions, and that derailed what had been an imperious run of form for him that summer and up to the final of the US Open. And of course, the match, as it went, the wind died down, we got into the evening. Djokovic, from 2 sets down, mounted a furious comeback. And this is where I gotta give Andy Murray, big props. Both here and the 2013 Wimbledon final, which I've talked about, the mental effort in the last game in the Wimbledon list. But for a guy that had been dealt with such a big setback in 2012 at the Wimbledon final, it really looming over him for if he would ever be able to get the monkey off his back and win a Grand Slam. And it seemed like maybe we were drawing up the most brutal loss yet, from 2 sets to love up. I think it was a great effort to come back, compose himself, and play a great 5th set and bring that one home. Not a great final, but listen, the wind was there for both guys. Murray still had to hold off Djokovic once that became less of a factor later in the match. Beat a handful of really quality opponents along the way, and beat Djokovic in a time where this was right in the heart of what I believe to be the greatest era of men's tennis, to bag his first Grand Slam title. Not a bad way to cap off what would end up shockingly being Andy Murray's last great US Open result. Number 5, getting into the big guns here. And yeah, I would say probably, until this year, our last all-time great US Open run. And at the time, the source of this win couldn't have been more improbable. And that is 2014 Marin Cilic. Now, Cilic had been around a long time at this point. He was a guy that found success super early, had been established as a really, really talented guy. But in this era, right in the thick of still the Big 4 dominance, him being a talented guy that had made deep runs and just seemed like he was just destined to never be able to get over the hump and win the big ones, that made him one of many, and he wasn't even at the top of the list among those guys. And I don't know, that wouldn't really change on the other side of this win, but boy, over the course of week 2 of this fortnight, that is how you rewrite the narrative on your career. A week 2 that started with Marin surviving a 5-setter with tour stalwart and the ever-grindy Gilles Simon. After that, Super Cilic was in the building. Form that was an absolute dream that arguably he would never or seldom replicate the rest of his career, certainly not for a sustained run of matches that mattered this much. But the quarters in a match who probably would favor Thomas Berdych, he absolutely blows him aside and outguns one of the most powerful and clean ball strikers of the time, and was still uber consistent at this time, among the top of the guys of the non-slam winners of that time. And then you remember the semifinals. I remember going into the second semifinal of that day. Earlier, Nishikori had taken out Novak Djokovic, and it seemed like the stars were aligning here for Roger Federer, who had just come back from 2 sets to love down in the quarterfinals, for him to finally break his slam drought. And once the match started, Cilic was having absolutely none of that. I remember the first set, he broke Federer from 40 love down, and the rest of the match really was a blur. It was shocking to see Roger Federer really bullied in a way that you don't see very often at all throughout the course of his sparkling career. After going down 2 sets, he broke in Cilic's opening game, I think, of the third set. And you're thinking, okay, here he comes. There's no way that Marin can, sustain this hitting from the heavens. But lo and behold, he hopped right back on the wagon. Never really left it up to chance. And you got this real outlier final here in this time of Cilic versus Nishikori for the US Open title. Kei, for his part, had done his fair share of giant killing as well this tournament, and certainly was in with a chance unless Cilic would replicate his form from the last 2 matches in the final. Lo and behold, he did, and perhaps put forth his most comprehensive performance of the entire tournament. Like 2012 Andy, this run also has a lot of quality players beaten along the way, but Marin Cilic did it with an extra layer of dominance, and he was so good these last 3 matches. He would have been a handful for anybody, even the names I have above him on this list. Another tricky rank for me, but I put him in the middle here at number 5. Alright, so now firmly being in the all-time territory of this list, at number 4, let's go 2015 Novak Djokovic. I've been most excited to do this for the US Open because, as far as the 2010s are concerned, this is, I think, to me, a very clear-cut top 4. There's a very clear, 1A, 1B situation that's, in my opinion, as close as any top 2 as I've done for the other 3 slams. But also, if there is such a thing for 3 and 4, I also view this as a 2A, 2B. I'm not too bothered if you shuffle it up however you see fit for 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. But here I go, 2015 Novak Djokovic. Not much to see here. Pretty standard trot through up to the final. You got 6 breadstick sets on the way here. Notably, I'm not sure how this stacks up historically, but a demolition job of Marin Cilic, who was not 100%, but still as lopsided a semifinal as you will ever see, that too against the quality opponent who was, of course, the defending champion. Main thing to talk about here is the final, which is one of Djokovic's most famous victories, of course, arguably his most iconic celebration. Everybody talks about, of course, this being arguably the most blatant example of him versus the world as far as the crowd support against Federer. But regarding the match itself, I remember when I watched this match, I came away, the number 1 headliner stat was, of course, the 4 for 23 from Federer on break points. It was another big match where break pointer showed up. What a choke. this match was right there for him. But as I have gotten older, I really have grown to appreciate the effort from both players. This is a super entertaining final, particularly those middle two sets. And yeah, I thought the contrast from the Wimbledon final to this one that year was really striking in how Federer honestly played this match to perfection, as well as he possibly could have, given where these two were in their respective careers. And that was just janky things up, realize I can no longer go with, still in his prime Novak Djokovic from the baseline like he tried at Wimbledon. And that resulted in just like kamikaze, all-out aggression. Obviously, this summer, the Sabre was a big thing, and stayed, despite the highlight of the lob over the Sabre. It stayed a relatively effective tactic in this final, and Federer was just, net rushing, pulling the trigger at the first hint of a ball that didn't even really have to be that attackable, just a ball that was neutral. And yeah, doing so, you were naturally going to be errant, but I don't think people appreciate enough that probably only Roger Federer was talented enough to pull this off in this final to the extent that he did against, again, an all-time great, like, right in the thick of the peak of his powers. Even though on the scoreboard, the 14 Wimbledon final, he might have gotten closer, I feel like in those matches and slams between 2014 and 2016 with Federer and Djokovic, this was definitely the one most played on Roger Federer's terms, and that's where you really got to appreciate the performance from Novak, who was just rock solid, never wavered mentally. In some prior years, even maybe the year before this one, he might not have had the focus, or his rhythm might have been thrown off to withstand this all-out aggression, or have the versatility in his game like he did at this point in time to maneuver around all that variety and kitchen sink that Federer threw at him. So from a tennis standpoint, I think that gets lost in the shuffle among all the, praise on what a great mental effort this final was, which it deservedly so was. A standout win in Novak Djokovic's finest season. Well played from start to finish, even if I think it wasn't necessarily like the beast mode apex that we saw in 2015 in the Wimbledon final or throughout the fall post-US Open. Which brings us to our number 3 spot and my 2A in this scenario between 3 and 4, and that is 2013 Rafael Nadal. This year's US Open, of course, bringing home the sweep of the summer hardcourt season between Canada, Cincinnati, and the US Open. And yeah, guys, we're getting into the really good stuff now because I honestly do cherish these 2010-13 US Opens from Rafa, perhaps more than any other wins of his career. Just chef's kiss. Him just forehanding, serving, ground strokes in general, everything firing on all cylinders, having that swagger about him, doing so in the most epic kits. He really brought the sauce to both of these US Opens. Again, like number 4 on in this list, the lead up to the final was a formality. The only bit of suspense, the only questions to be had would be in the final. But of course, before that, worth noting, only broken one time en route to the final, which is worth talking about because, unlike 2010, he wasn't serving particularly big as far as quality of serve. It was pretty run-of-the-mill Nadal stuff. More so utilizing it as a point starter and trying to get himself into the patterns of first ball forehand that he liked. So that goes to show, how good a place the rest of his game was once the ball was in play. Particularly the forehand during this period was probably, in my opinion, the best it ever was from like 2012 to 2014. Was more willing to take it up the line, even in spots where it was low margin, and did so very successfully often. And I think doing so more frequently than at any other point in his career. He was just so confident in that shot during this phase. Could really just put it on a dime whenever he wanted. But yeah, rolls into the final. The final test would be Novak Djokovic. And yeah, I think this is, again, a similar match to the final for the number 4 spot. It's two really good middle 2 sets. I think the difference being that Djokovic's lows were lower in the first set and then the second half of the fourth. But for the middle two sets, I would also say that the highs for Djokovic were just a smidge higher. And yeah, at points in time in that second, third set as a Nadal fan, it looked a little bit like 2011, where it seemed like he was really taking the bull by the horns here and seemingly taking over. I still think, yeah, sure, he got a little bit of help, but I still think that third set is like peak Nadal clutchness. One of the great Houdini acts I have ever seen. Our man pull, and it basically won him the match. Really seemed to deject Djokovic for good, going from down a break, point for a double break, and then 4-all love 40, and Nadal just dug in, refused to lose, came up with some great, brave play under pressure. All of that, I think, made those middle two sets pretty peak Raffole. Some amazing rallies, obviously. The 54-shot one was the standout. And holistically, I think the performance on his end, I think the tactical masterclass of it gets lost in the shuffle because this is probably the best slicing match of Nadal's career. A nice example of, like, kind of effective junk balling. And what made it that much more effective, of course, was the trademark of him during this period, was his more aggressive positioning for himself than usual, never backing off of that, closer to the baseline. It was allowed, of course, by just how sweet the timing on his forehand was, and I do really think that came up huge, even when the match seemed to be turning on him a little bit and he seemed to be getting bullied some. He was never deterred. All in all, super, super complete performance. I think this is a Mount Rushmore win of his career, and was really the cherry on top, stamping a legendary Storybook 2013 season. So that brings us to the second spot. And well, I gotta slot in my favorite ever form of Rafael Nadal here at number 2. Now, coming into the 2010 US Open, there was nothing to really go on as far as hardcourt form that would have suggested such a monstrous performance. And you guys have probably seen it across Twitter, the Bleacher Report articles going into this tournament of why Nadal will never win the US Open, this being the last one to tick off for the career Grand Slam, and to this point the most difficult for him. But all of that is just telling of the bigger picture here, where someday I will get into the myths that some of you guys throw around for this guy off clay. Someday. Probably very far from now, because I have a lot to say that would require a deep dive on its own. But that being that, for a player of his caliber, streakier than you'd realize, but at any given moment, he could throw out one of the highest peaks that we have ever seen in his prime. And the US Open 2010 is some of the first and foremost tape that you would submit to back that up. And let's be honest, doing it in his dopest outfit of all time, with that night session fit, seeing him look and play like an assassin, a man on a mission, we gotta give out some Aura points. It capped out here, honestly. He was an utterly imperious form, never left anything up to chance. I mean, the hypothetical Nadal with a great serve, for these 2 weeks in New York, he materialized here and really delivered. I mean, the percentages stayed high, spots were being hit in the 130s up to 135, and that resulted in one of the most confident versions we have ever seen of Rafael Nadal. The forehand was forehanding. He was still somewhere very close to his physical zenith still, as far as the speed and movement, until that elite post-prime phase of his career where it became more of a staple to make up for the loss of movement. I hadn't seen him hit his backhand with such aggressive intent and so big outside of probably the 2009 Aussie Open final. And really, this tournament is the closest approximation for that, like, barbershop, what if we put the mindset of the late career veteran, the more aggressive-minded Rafa under Carlos Moya, who made all these adjustments and was a smarter player to make up for the athletic decline, and put that together with, like, his prime physicality. That is more or less what this tournament resembles for me. I would imagine it would look something like Rafael Nadal at the 2010 US Open. Really just perfected tennis for those 2 weeks. This year only broken twice, and second round on played his fair share of dangerous opponents on their day, but he was a man on a mission. He had a date with destiny to complete this career Grand Slam, and he made it look easy, not to be denied. Here he faced Novak Djokovic in the final as well, right as, if not, just before he was approaching his sort of tennis coming of age. And I'll tell you, yeah, 2010 Djokovic had a pretty dismal year for his standards. But honestly, you zoom out, look at Djokovic's lost finals at the US Open, I think this one's performance has to rank pretty high among them. He was a better player in 2013, but I think he played better and put in a better showing for himself in the 2010 match. For 3 sets, these guys were hitting the cover off the ball. Really, really quality match, and for Rafa, as far as quality goes, a performance that was really as good as it gets for him on a hard court. That is your 1B. Let me cope with the fact that I couldn't put this one up top. Which make way for your number 1. Topping the US Open 2010's ranking is 2011 Novak Djokovic. He ran out of steam right after this tournament for the season, but if you guys know that SpongeBob Mr. Krabs meme where he's like telling him a spooky story around a fire, for those of us that were there to see it, that is basically how we talk about 2011 Novak Djokovic, especially through this US Open. Even though his tournament started with bagels in 3 out of the first 4 completed sets, not quite as dominant as some of the entries lower than him, but it really is as simple as the baseline buzzsaw that reigned over the tour and lost 1 completed match through the major season and the US Open. He reigned on for 1 more tournament here. Djokovic here, still at the apex of some of his most formidable qualities, that being his dual-winged baseline attack, his returning, and his physicality throughout the course of 2011. And probably the most impressive display of beating 2 members of the Big Three en route to winning a Grand Slam title. I just can't bring myself to dock him for not being as dominant when he played 2 very good, formidable versions of Federer and Nadal in the semis and the finals. For a good portion of their semifinal, it seemed like a continuation of his only other loss in a completed match of 2011, with Federer stunning him at the French Open. In the pairs semi-final match, Roger Federer's serve forehand combo clicking just enough and actually being quite clutch in those first 2 sets to take a 2-set-to-love lead. Novak, of course, never one to go quietly into that good night. This time got it into a 5th set, where again, the Roger Federer serve took over and reigned supreme. He was hardly losing points in that 5th set on serve. And then the pivotal 8th game really looked like it was going to be the finishing blow. 1 loose Djokovic service game, Federer to serve for it, got to 40-15. You know the rest. My 2 cents, this is the coldest moment I have ever seen in tennis history. All of it is just cinema. The nodding, and then following it up, just taking a step to his side and slapping probably the greatest return of all time off a first serve for a winner. And then telling the crowd, you got to get up. By the way, while still down 1 more match point on the Roger Federer serve. Just unreal. You guys know the rest. Rode that momentum all the way back into the final, where he met a Rafael Nadal that he had tormented all season long, and continued to do throughout the course of much of this match. The highlights of this match, of course, neither guy served particularly great, but Rafa suffering all the more for it, with his going into the Djokovic return at its very best. Breaks galore, but also for much of 3 sets, this match compiled a hell of a highlight reel, has ownership of some of the greatest points of all time, a contender for greatest set of all time. Scoreline is a bit misleading. I mean, a lot of this featured just peak animalistic baseline attrition from Nadal and Djokovic. It is one of the few times that you will see a prime Nadal being worn down to the point of like visible fatigue by the 4th set, just by virtue of what he was having to do to even allow himself to see a 4th set. And yeah, Djokovic's baseline brilliance stood a cut above, and stood out to see him hoist up his first US Open trophy and the number 1 spot on this list. Which wraps up my ranking of the US Open champions of the 2010s. Expected to get to this one earlier than we did. Happened in a year where I think Carlos Alcaraz put forth probably the first all-time great US Open title run since 2015 Djokovic, I'd say. Happy to finally have finished this series for all 4 slams. It was one of the first ideas I had on this channel. Even before I had started this YouTube channel, I was sort of making mock lists for these rankings at all 4 slams throughout the pandemic lockdown season in 2020, and then finally uploading the first one, I think, in early 2021. I would love to keep doing stuff like this, maybe expand it out to Masters champions as well as the World Tour Finals champions, maybe even doing some 2000s rankings somewhere down the line. But that'll do it for this video. I know this one ran longer than the rest of them, but hey, this is my favorite slam. I had a lot to say. Some of my favorite title runs as a fan came here, so I just hope it wasn't too rambly. I felt like I kept my comments relevant, at least I hope so. But if you stuck around to this point in the video, I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. We can now get on to Asian Swing, the indoor season. But yeah, I will see y'all in the next one.